Welcome to episode 310 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Gretchen Bridgers of Always a Lesson about how to unlock the secrets of effective lesson design. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. This episode is brought to you in part by a really important podcast that I hope you'll check out. It's called Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently. It's hosted by Julian Saavedra, an assistant principal in Philadelphia who's spent nearly 20 years working in public schools. You'll hear Julian talk with parents and experts to offer tools that will help you support your students. You can even share this free podcast with kids' families, as it's also a wonderful resource for parents. To listen to Opportunity Gap, just search for Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently in your podcast app. That's Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently. If you use Google Chrome, you need to know about my favorite free Chrome extension for teachers. It's called Brisk Teaching, and it can instantly trim hours off the time it takes to write high-quality, personalized feedback on student work. And that feedback tool is just one of 30-plus tools that Brisk offers, including creating Google Slides and Google Form quizzes. Add Brisk to Chrome for free by heading to briskteaching.com. Today's episode is for the folks who feel like you're spinning your wheels trying to improve your teaching, but you're not seeing the results you want. We're going to be delving into the transformative power of sequential lesson design with Gretchen Bridgers of Always a Lesson. Gretchen is a friend of mine who is a teacher coach and a trainer, and she spent more than 2 decades mentoring and coaching educators, as well as leading professional development. She has a fantastic podcast called Always a Lesson's Empowering Educators Podcast, which I often recommend to Truth for Teachers listeners because there's a lot of overlap between Gretchen's mindset and her areas of interest and my own. I find her advice to be really practical and spot on. She also recently published her 3rd book called Always a Lesson: Teacher Essentials for Classroom and Career Success. In our conversation that you'll hear today, Gretchen breaks down some key ideas from that book. She counters the common narrative that classroom management is the first and most important thing to nail down, and reveals why lesson design is actually the secret sauce to transforming your classroom. You'll learn how to identify and fill gaps in your current instructional strategies, avoid common pitfalls that even veteran teachers fall into, and use simple ideas like video self-reflection to revolutionize your teaching. Gretchen's fresh take on reusing what works instead of constantly reinventing the wheel is a total game changer for busy teachers. Listen in. So, Gretchen, much of our focus on instructional improvements are in isolated blocks. We try to work on routines and procedures for a while, and then consequences for student behavior, and then engaging lessons, and so on. But your book centers around the idea that if we approach growing instructional skills in a sequential way, we can make and see improvements faster. And in fact, you argue that the sequence is the magic. So tell us about this. What happens when we try to improve pieces of instruction in random isolation?
I'm glad you asked, because I think we are doing this without even realizing we're doing it. We are listening to what the district says, this is our focus, or what if school has decided this is what we're working on. And across the board, it's like, classroom management or student engagement's low or our scores are awful, so we're going to do this. And when you do that, it creates a haphazard attack. And so you're working endlessly. Your wheels are spinning. You're exerting so much effort and energy, and you're not seeing a return. Students are learning, but maybe not growing as fast. And you're thinking to yourself, I don't understand. I'm dedicating so much time to improving in this one area. Why am I not seeing the gains? And it's because there's something underneath the surface that still needs to get worked out. And once that's solidified, then you'll take off and then you'll see the returns. And so it really has to be a differentiated approach based on what's happening with that teacher, with that specific grade or that specific subject. And so we'll talk more about this in depth in a minute, but one thing I just caution everyone is just choosing a blanket thing to focus on, and everyone works on that because it's not going to translate to the academic gains you are hoping for.
That's an important point because I feel a lot of schools do it that way. Like, this is our focus for the year and everyone's going to improve on this.
Right. But not everyone needs to, nor do they need to work on the same things within that umbrella of things, right? And it really takes skillful and intentional eye to decide this is the piece for you, and this is how it all builds. And for one teacher, it could change if you have different classes of students coming in. It's a yin and yang relationship, and so how you approach instruction differs based on who's in the room. And so you may not need to work on the same thing with each class. And so I think that's allowed folks to really take a sigh of relief of, no wonder I'm not seeing the progress. I'm just not attacking it in the right way.
You've named your recommended sequence the Teacher Success Pathway, and you refer to each instructional focus in the sequence as a brick, because when we build instruction from the ground up, it's firm. It stands the test of time. And there are 4 bricks which should be laid in this order: lesson design, classroom management, student engagement, and student choice and ownership. And I find that order intriguing because often teachers are told that classroom management should be the first thing they focus on. Why is lesson design first?
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up. When I first started coaching, that was all we worked on with our new teachers. No matter if you taught kindergarten or seniors in high school, it was classroom management, because they assume you came into this teaching position knowing how to write a lesson plan. Well, lesson design is not necessarily the plan, the piece of paper. A design is like you're putting on a play from start to finish, how everything orchestrates together. And when you don't think thoroughly of how you're going to execute this lesson, then things start to crop up and create issues. And so there's a method to the madness. And so even though we do see problems with classroom management, it actually cannot be fixed by just sitting there and putting out fires all day, because you're not gaining academic time on the clock. You have to go in below it to the planning phase so you can prevent the misbehaviors from even occurring. That's how you get more time on task. You get to deeper learning. Students can showcase what they've learned. And so a lot of folks think, I know how to write a lesson plan. I'm like, listen, it's not the format. That's not what I'm talking about. We have to think about how we're executing this lesson start to finish. And there's so many details. And if we're not thinking through it, we're going to have issues crop up that prevent us from being successful. So classroom management is a huge brick that we need to work on. It's just not necessarily first for some folks.
So let's get into this whole lesson design thing. What's the process that teachers should use to address their lesson design issues?
So the first thing is alignment, and they've learned this in school. We learn it in our PLCs. You have your standard, you've written your daily objective related to the standard, and then you go to the end and you assess whether it's informal, formal, but how do we know students know and are able to do whatever we've just taught? And then once that's all aligned, then we can go put in the fun little activities and practices along the way. And so when you feel like you've done at least the alignment piece, then I urge you to start chunking your lesson. So the introductory portion, when students walk in the room, what happens? What are you doing? What are they doing? How much time do they have? What's the volume? How do they get materials? See how it's like so much more than just, oh, they do a do now, and this is the question they're answering. No, there's so much happening, and we have to plan for that. And then after you've chunked the introduction and you feel confident and you feel competent in running that thoroughly, then you're thinking about your direct instruction. You can rehearse in the car, you can rehearse in the shower. What are you trying to convey to students? What is the main idea? How can you be super concise and very clear in your delivery so that they don't get confused? And once you've got the I do portion, then chunk it to the we do. What are you going to do together to practice what you just taught? How are students going to be paired together? Where are they going to go around the room to do it? What materials do they have or need access to? And so on and so forth. And you go through the rest of the lesson, what they're going to do on their own, how you're going to assess. And when you start chunking your lesson, you'll realize man, this one part of my lesson is always tripping me up. This is where I lose students, or this is where they don't get engaged, or this is where the flare-ups of classroom management happen. And now you can hone in. It's not like I have to rewrite this lesson plan. No, we have to hack this one section, and we have to think about it all the way down the nitty-gritty of what's happening, so we can prevent, put in protocols and procedures to make sure it's efficient and that they're actually able to produce what you're wanting them to produce. And then if you feel like, okay, I've got the chunking, I feel like I've attacked the section that continues to be a problem, now we go into scripting. And this is either you're scripting your questions that you want to ask students, you're scripting maybe the main points of the lesson, like I have to make sure I say this. I cannot forget to say this is the essential piece. And then you even script ideal student answers, because if you don't know what you want to hear from them or see on their paper, then how are you going to know that they are traveling along the path ready to be successful at the end of the lesson? So you really got to think through, what am I asking and what are they going to tell me? And once you've kind of scripted and rehearsed that, now you're ready to think about the management, the engagement, the ownership piece. But all of this thinking and preciseness happens in the planning phase. And you might think, gosh, this takes a long time. Like, in college, I had a week to write a 7-page lesson plan. Like, I can't do that now. And I totally agree. But a lot of this is how you run a room. It's the vibe of your classroom. Is you're going to reuse a lot of these things you're putting in place. You're just swapping in and out content. And so, yes, in the beginning, it's like, whoa, I really got to get a handle on how I want things done and how I can support students to do it in that way and explain to them the purpose of why they should do things and get them on board. But once you've done that over and over, it just becomes the way you do things. And it's really helped students achieve and feel confident to go on to the next grade level. And obviously, teachers are much more prepared to teach at a deeper level and then continue to help generations of kids.
I think that piece about reusing things that work well is so crucial. That's the piece that takes us from being overwhelming to actually doable, especially with the limited amount of planning time that teachers have in the US. This idea that every lesson does not need to be completely different. And in fact, we can waste a lot of our own time and waste instructional time trying to chase this like new and shiny thing. And we think that we have to keep adding in all of this new variety in order to keep kids engaged. But if you don't have the fundamentals in place, then my advice, and I think what your advice would be too, is to focus on finding something that works, repeat that over and over, refine it, get it really, really good. And then you can switch things up. You can add little activities in there, but you need to know what's actually working well. And don't be afraid to rely on that instead of always looking for something different. You should not be doing, in my opinion, as a teacher, you should not be doing something completely different every single day, because then you're just reinventing the wheel. And kids are spending so much of their cognitive load is spent trying to figure out what do the teacher want me to do? What am I supposed to be doing here? How do I experience success? Am I supposed to do it like this? When you're following these sort of like, lesson routines and these activities that are effective for your students, they can focus on the learning because they're not so busy trying to figure out what's going on, what's happening next, where are we going with this?
Yes, when you can create a habit, it frees up the brain space to actually focus on the new information, process it, store it, and reuse it again. So yes, let's create strong habits and do simple things well.
Let's continue with the teacher success pathway analogy of laying these brick foundations. So once this lesson design brick is laid in place, you then move on to classroom management, followed by student engagement, and then finally student choice and ownership. These sound like these are all pretty related. Can you explain the sequence and how it works?
Yeah, and I wish I could take credit like, oh, I invented this really cool thing. I didn't. It's just from watching what great teachers do and where teachers get trouble. And I realized, man, when they start working on things in a certain order, now kids are just soaring. And this is fantastic because we're all working hard and we're all trying our best. But it seems to be a certain way and rhythm and sequence that matters most. And so once you've planned everything, now you can focus on the classroom management, which, by the way, is not behavior management. It's not, you have to sit a certain way and act a certain way. Like, we cannot control people, and that will only make you more frustrated in the end. And it's so distracting to you being able to deliver a lesson because you're putting out fires. And so a lot of the prevention comes in the planning. You know how your lesson is supposed to go. Of course, you have consequences if necessary, but the goal is to not have to get to that point because you're so well planned. And so when you're actually executing your lesson, you're now actually able to have a self-run classroom, which is important because another brick is about ownership. But kids can't own the classroom until you've created the system and the processes for it to be self-running. And so this is what I mean about the sequence matters. We have to lay the bricks and allow them lots of reps to practice and get used to how things are run. And then you can move into engagement. How do I want you to engage with me, the teacher, with your peers, and with the content? And we do that throughout the lesson. It's not like one section. It's constantly, you need to engage in these 3 levels to help you learn and understand and ask questions. And yes, this is where it gets fun and we can have really cool activities or use great tech tools. But again, it's not about checking the boxes. It's about how can I have a rigorous discussion that'll help you better understand content. And I can't do that if my classroom setting isn't shored up and it isn't solid and I'm busy dealing with other issues. And so now that the classroom and the processes are in place, we can engage at high levels without it getting out of control. And then when I've managed it and facilitated, guess whose turn it is? Now it's time for that ownership for kids to run the show. They're asking questions. They're answering their peers' questions. They're running the delivery of the lesson that day. They're showcasing their learning at high levels, but you cannot get there, which is the piece everyone wants to do because it's fun, unless everything below it is in place. And so the sequence matters, that you've thought things through, that you create the processes in the classroom and run it well so that students can engage at high levels so that then they can have the ownership and the accountability necessary to perform well.
In your book, you said that many times teachers feel like they're strong in one area, but the root of the issues that they're seeing is actually in that area. There's a future brick that is not solid because of the foundation underneath of it. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, what are some of the common patterns that you've noticed when you're working through the teacher success pathway with educators? What are some common things that teachers may not be aware of that are sort of sabotaging their success?
Yeah, it is sabotage, and it's like Swiss cheese, and we have to figure out where the holes are in our bricks. And this happens a lot with veteran teachers who are like, listen, I have lesson planned for decades. Like, I run my classroom like a dictator. Like, those kids are in rows and they're quiet and they do what I ask them to do. And I'm like, that's great and everything. And I'm sure you have great test scores, but sometimes there's things that we need to tweak based on who's in the room. You might have taught for years, but have you ever taught this kid or this group of kids or in this current environment or what's happening with culture? Now we've got a new curriculum. There's always a new element that forces us, no matter how many years we've been teaching, to go back to that lesson design phase and say, do I have holes? Is this Swiss cheese or are we good? Now let's go to brick 2, classroom management. How are things looking with this group? And if you are in middle school or high school and your classes are changing, you're going to be in different bricks depending on which group of kids you have. And that's totally normal. You just respond with where you are together as a unit. And so the first problem that I'm noticing is a misdiagnosis. So they might notice the eruption. So for example, wow, I walk in the classroom, the kids are all talking and they're sitting on top of their desks and they're not paying attention. And so we think classroom management. Well, that's where the eruption happened. But is that the root of the problem? No, it happened in planning because the teacher didn't plan when students walk in, we drop our backpacks off, we grab our pencils, we sit down at our desk, we have the do now projected on the board, and we're silently working, right? That has to come before you can even deal with students sitting on the desk because it's not going to happen because you've already prevented. You've got a routine in place. And so sometimes we're misdiagnosing. We're seeing where the fire is and we're saying this is the problem, but that's not actually the root of the problem. And the second piece I notice is disillusionment, which is we're not self-reflective, or maybe we lack awareness and denial, maybe, especially if we've been teaching a while, of like how bad it is. And so we just keep doing what we've always done, thinking it's going to work itself out. And it just doesn't work itself out. And so we have to be open to constantly learning about how to be responsive to the people in front of us. And so the solution to either of these two problems is first understand the teacher success path, understand why the bricks are in the order that they are, how they rely on each other, how some are more important than others in terms of being foundational. And then set up a camera for the piece of your lesson that you know things go sideways. And I don't need to see it. No one else needs to see it. But when you watch it as a third party participant, you start to notice, oh, I didn't notice this was happening over here. Or I swore my directions were clear. And you start seeing things from a new perspective and you're like, okay, I know exactly where I need to tweak and fix. And with Swiss cheese, it's not going to take forever to work on something. You could fill the holes real fast and boom, you're up to the next brick. So I want you to be encouraged, even though you think, I don't want to go all the way back to the beginning. It's not going to take a long time because you already know great teaching practices. You have experience. If you're brand new, you're excited to figure it out and you have this roadmap to rely on. There are ways to continue to grow, and pre-planning with your coach or your colleagues in PLCs is the best way to make sure your bricks are solid and moving in the right direction.
That tip about videoing a part of your lesson that you know is probably going to be problematic or that hasn't worked in the past, I think is really important because not everyone has the support of an instructional coach. Right. I mean, this is the kind of work that you and I do as coaches, and there should be dedicated time for this. This is not something that teachers should have to do on their own. However, in reality, not everyone has that support, and that doesn't mean that you are completely stuck. I noticed when I videoed my teaching that when I would give directions, like I would be transitioning from whole class instruction to some sort of independent practice, I would tell the students what to do. And I thought they weren't listening because they would be like, what did she say? What are we doing? What page? And I thought that the issue was them. And when I watched the video of myself, I realized I trail off when I give directions. Like in my head, I already know what I want them to do. So I just don't say it as loudly and clearly. So I'm like, okay, so here's what we're going to do. And it's on page 14. And they're like, what? Wait, what? Huh? I didn't emphasize. I need to really be very clear about, okay, here is exactly what we're going to do, project my voice and maintain engagement with the students before releasing them. And I was only paying attention to the timing of it. Like, okay, if I have them all listening to me and then I release them all at the same time to go do it, that should fix it. And it didn't because I wasn't clear enough. And there's no way I would have known that other than seeing myself on video. So even something like that can make a really big difference in terms of how well an instruction goes and how much class time is wasted trying to get kids to do what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. 100% agree. And you think in your head exactly what you said, that you know what you need them to do. And it's the first time they're hearing it. You might have drafted it 12 times and thought about it and think you're clear. So the videotape doesn't lie. It's like, okay, I see.
Yeah, they can be really helpful. What recommendations do you have for a teacher who is excited about this whole process and wants to delve into their instruction and needs a good place to get started? I'd like to think about like a quick, easy win for someone to get right away, and then a good place to start for more in-depth transformation and analyzation of their teaching.
Okay, so like a quick win, you can self-diagnose and get to the root. I've got printables both in the book and on my website that you can just download for free and do a self-assessment. Like, I think I need to work on student ownership, but really it's really falling apart in the management piece, and I'm not quite ready to get there. And I think that's an easy way for you to just, okay, this is the reality of the situation, and I know my next steps. And if you're like, I want more, I'm ready to really do a deep dive, then we've got a book study that you can join. I'll announce the dates on the website and on my newsletter, so make sure you're on that too. But you take it slow, because I love to read, and I will binge a book in a weekend, and then I put it on a shelf and I'm thinking, am I actually applying what I'm learning, or am I just like going through it? And so I really want you to use this book as a resource, meaning read chapter 3 and ahead of chapter 1, however it makes sense for what you need when you need it. But stop at that section and reflect and think, what does this look like for me right now? Try it out, make some tweaks, and then move on in the book that way, instead of just like trying to get through it, because it's really meant to be a support to you. And reread it as you get new groups of kids, or you change schools and the dynamics of leadership change. You can always come back to this foundation.
That's a great suggestion because, your book is this. This is not a bingeable book. This is not a book you take to the beach and you read it all the way straight through in a weekend. Like this is definitely something that you would want to keep coming back to. So when you notice, okay, there's something off with student engagement, there's something off with lesson design, let me go back to that chapter and look specifically at what to do, because it's organized in a way that it's very easy to find. You don't have to read through a whole bunch of, anecdotes and all this other like fluff and filler. It's very to the point, like, okay, here's what's going on in the classroom and here's what you can take a look at.
Exactly.
Is there anything else that you can think of that we can share with teachers about improving their lesson design issues right away? Common things that, teachers are grappling with, which could include things like students, not following directions the first time that they're told, or not paying attention, talking when the teacher is talking. Are there any kind of issues or any kind of lesson design issues that can fix that?
Yeah, I think when you sit with somebody else and you start talking through your plan, which is what a PLC is. I know we get in the bad habit of, okay, you write this section and I'm going to write this section and then we're going to share it and turn it in. But it's not that. It's like, hey, let me talk this through. This is what I'm thinking. And the person starts asking you questions like, wait, who's saying that? Or who's supposed to be doing that? Or who's paired with who? And is that a strong combination? Is one person going to be dominant? Or that's a great question, but I think you need to add a smaller question before it that leads up to that. And I think the perspective of someone else hearing your idea for this lesson allows you to find the holes in your own planning of like, oh, you're right, I need to connect this better here. Or if I add this little procedure here, that'll get rid of playing trash skip ball, throwing stuff out in the corner, the fun things that kids do. We know our kids, and we also know our content. And so sometimes it just takes time to talk it out with somebody for them to showcase where we might need to hone in and pay more attention and do a more thorough design, not just plan, but a design.
Mm-hmm. That design piece, I feel like is tough when you don't have a ton of planning time. And, I feel like this is something that we just don't value that much in schools. And that could be part of why it goes it goes left so easily because we really don't have the time to think about the design piece. And we're looking for little quick, tips and tricks, and let's do this and play this game with your students and they'll be involved. But, really sitting down and looking at, okay, what is the design of this lesson? How does this work? Like you're saying, like a play from start to finish.
Yeah.
And thinking about how the different elements fit together. I think that is really the heart of good teaching. And it's been lost, I think, in some ways, in schools in our country, because we're not emphasizing that and we're not prioritizing it. And as a matter of fact, I think we're prioritizing assessment over designing the activity that we're assessing. Yeah. We're going straight to like, what's the outcome? But like, we're not paying as much attention. Yeah. We're not paying as much attention to what's going into it. And I think that this is a root issue that so many of the surface issues can be solved with, instead of doing all these little Band-Aid solutions around, how students are behaving or what kids are doing or not doing, that really looking at, okay, what is a really solid instructional design for a lesson in my content area with my grade level? And then how do I tweak that for these kids in the room? How do I make this work for these individuals? I think it's just a much more satisfying approach. It's much more holistic and much less, I think a lot of times classroom issues can feel like just a game of whack-a-mole. You're going from thing to thing to thing. And this is so much more structured and therefore more satisfying and gets you better results.
And I'll tell you, to your time point, just like at the beginning of the year, if you don't put the time in to talk about the procedures and how to run the classroom, then you're just going to be dealing with that all year long. Same is true with lesson design. Fine, you don't have time, you can't make time. You're going to be dealing with these same issues for the rest of the year because you're not prioritizing. Just like we have to prioritize rest so we can allow our brain to be creative and produce great results, the same is true with lesson design. I'm not saying you have to sit down and be physically present with somebody to design well. You could be doing this in the car, while you're running, while you're doing errands, while you're grocery shopping. And like you've mentioned before in the beginning of our talk, it's like we can reuse a lot of this, but we got to figure it out to begin with and start tweaking it. And it does take some time in the beginning, but the payoff is huge. And it's not always going to take this amount of time, but you do have to prioritize the time.
I want to close out with a takeaway truth. What's something that you wish every teacher understood about lesson design and the things we talked about today?
I just think if you think beyond the plan, the piece of paper, and you envision like this major learning experience and how you're going to be able to execute it to the best of your ability, you are starting to focus on, is this a safe, rigorous learning environment where my students can be highly engaged and become leaders of their learning, which is the ultimate goal, brick number 4. It really comes down to taking pride in how we plan and execute this learning experience for them. And when we sequentially attack our planning methods in this way, the quality of teaching and learning that's going to happen in our classroom is astronomical. And it's going to have a trickle effect around your whole school building. So it's just the mentality of designing something and taking pride in it and making time for it is going to make all the difference.